Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I often think about what an anomaly is. To me, an anomaly is something that you don't expect, something that's a little different than one might be expecting to have happen. And today we're going to go down some anomaly roads with our special guest. First of all, though, I want to recognize my friend and co-host, Gwen Farrell. Gwen, how are you doing? You
I'm
said
doing
things are,
great. Weather in Phoenix is gorgeous today,
yes.
but I'm
Oh,
really glad to be here with our wonderful guest.
well, we're glad you're here too. So our guest today is Gary Heseltine, and he's going to talk about a place that we've done uh, a couple of shows on, Rendlesham Forest, and all the weird UFO events that went on there. Uh, we'd like to remind people who are listening to this to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That keeps the YouTube gods happy and it keeps us on the channel, I guess. So that's a good thing. So, Gary, welcome to Anomalies.
Thank you for inviting me onto the show.
Sure, anytime. We were talking a little bit about what got you interested in Rendlesham Forest, and to some degree, it sounds like your law enforcement background was responsible for that. Can you talk a little bit about how a former police officer would develop a interest in a UFO case in Rendlesham Forest?
Okay, my interest in the subject begins as a teenager at 16 when I have for want of a better word, a UFO sighting at the age of 16 with what was then my then girlfriend in my hometown of Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire. And cutting a long story short, we were walking along a very long footpath that ran beside my high school football pitches and soccer pitches, and on the other side there was a fence, and there was what we say in England is allotments, which is where people grow their own vegetables. It wasn't a built-up area of houses. Houses were in the distance, but there were no lighting in this long, narrow footpath. And as we were walking along this footpath, we noticed this very bright, indistinct white light, no real shape, moving from our right to left at perhaps maybe a 60-degree angle. And it was much bigger than the background stars. It was like August 1976, which in the UK was what's called the long hot summer, a very hot summer. And so there was no clouds. It was one of those balmy nights, t-shirt weather at 9 o'clock-ish time. And we were walking along, we see it, and we just look at it thinking that's a bit unusual. We don't hear anything. As the object then proceeded to move past us, so we were then behind its flight path. If you think of the path as a straight line ahead, and then it's gone past, so now we're behind it. All the housing lighting went into a power grid fairly. So it was really weird. So everything went dark, and as it was, there was no lighting on the footpath, so it made it even more darker. So we watched, thinking, "What is this?" My girlfriend, who was called Dawn, rightly or wrongly, was a bit anxious. She associated this strange light with maybe causing the power cut. It was too early to say that, but we kept watching it. It went a bit further, and then there was a further power cut behind it. So the entire area ahead of us was in pitch black. Now the light was moving very slowly, almost like gliding, but there was no noise, no distinct shape, and it was moving very slowly in the general direction of where I lived. Now at the time this first occurred, we weren't that far from my girlfriend's house, and I was pushing my bicycle with me. So I said, "Get on the crossbar, and I'll ride us both very quickly to your house, drop you off." And I thought, I'm going to see if I can catch up this light, and using my bicycle. So literally, I go to the end of the long alleyway, which would perhaps have been another 100 meters, turn right onto a little slip road, and then that was maybe another 200 meters to her house. Dropped her off. The entire area is without power. Parents are looking for candles to get something on, but it's pitch black basically. So I just literally drop her off. I then go back the way I'd come. I go back along the alleyway. I'm absolutely pedaling as fast as I can go. And then I eventually emerge onto a long road called Grange Lane South, which then took you towards where I lived. And I rode as fast as I could. Now, here's the strange thing. I probably went about half a mile before there is a left-hand bend in the road. And at the point of the bend in the ahead of me, I could see that the power was on. So you had this clear demarcation of all the power off, and then by this left-hand bend, the power and the house in the distance, including my house, was all lit up with normal power. So I remember getting to that corner, and for whatever reason, I instinctively look over my right shoulder, and I realise that I've managed to get ahead of the light. So I'm literally looking back slightly behind me, and it's up there. And I go around the corner. I then go maybe 50 metres, then turn right on what's called Westdale Road. I go maybe 75 metres and then do a right onto where I live, Baysdale Road, number 3. And literally drop and the power's still on. I drop my bike outside the house. I rush inside to the living room, and my parents are having a cup of tea, as English people do, at about 9 o'clock. It's at night. And I say, come outside. I think there's going to be a power cut caused by this strange light. And my parents just looked at me bemused. They didn't get up. So I literally ran out of the room. I went through the hall, into the kitchen, out the back door, to the bottom of my semi-detached garden, turned around to look back at my house, just in time to see the object coming over my rooftop, much higher in elevation, but it was silently gliding over my house. And I'm at the bottom of the garden, and to this day, I still don't know why I did it, but something instinctively prompted me to put my hand up in class, like I'm answering a question in class. And I think I was trying to make the 90 degrees. And as soon as the object went past me, so therefore I was behind the flight path, the entire area was plunged into a power cut. That's ridiculous. I can't predict power cuts. But on that occasion, it told me that that light, having moved to a second geographical location, had something to do with the power cut. And so that's literally how I got into it, some weird sighting like that. Cutting a long story short, moving forward, I joined the Royal Air Force, the military Royal Air Force, at the age of 23. And I did 6 years in the military. And for 3 of my 6 years, I served on 2 nuclear weapons storage area bases. One in Suffolk, which is where Rendlesham Forest is, called RAF Honington. And then I was then transferred out to what was then West Germany, and to a base called RAF Labrook, which is now closed, which is very close to the Dutch border, the border with Netherlands. And so I had that experience of knowing how to protect tactical nuclear weapons for aircraft on weapon storage areas. And later on, when I became aware of the Rendlesham case, I had this affinity to the case because I'd basically done the same job as the US Air Force security police personnel had done, both on mobile patrol, foot patrols, and also working inside a weapon storage area guarding tactical nuclear weapons. So it made me interested in the case. I left the Royal Air Force at the age of 29 and then joined the police. I then went on to have a 24-year career in the police, taking early retirement in 2013 at the age of 53. And the reason why I did that was, by that stage, in 2002, I'd launched an unofficial national database to collate British police officer sightings. So that was still while I was a serving detective in the police. I became an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses, which was designed for murder, manslaughter, and rape. And so basically, altogether, I have about 30 years of policing experience, both in the military and in the civilian police. And I can only ever look at any UFO case through what I call evidential eyes, what would stand up in a court of law, etc. You know, you look for corroboration, you look for the best evidence. And over the years, I'd obviously read a lot what was available, or thought I'd read a lot about the Rendlesham case. And then as I became more well known as a result of launching the police database, I got a lot of media attention. And so as people got to hear about what I was doing, eventually I was approached by the History Channel to do a segment for the UFO Hunters TV series. So we're talking 2007, and it would probably be September-ish when they first approached me, and they wanted to film me in the UK and talk about the cases on my police database. And I said, oh, that's great, okay. And then when it was down to the filming schedule, which was a few months later, I said, well, you're not just coming to interview me all the way from America just to interview me. And they said, no, we're actually going to do a segment on Rendlesham Forest. And that's when I raised my background in protecting nuclear weapons and my interest in the case. And I said, you know, is there any way I could get involved and ask Colonel Holt some questions? Because they told me that Colonel Holt was being brought across for this episode that they were filming. So I'd never met him, but I'd obviously heard about him, read about him. So it was a big thrill for me when they said, yeah, you come down to the filming schedule. And fair enough, and sure enough, in late December 2007, I then went down to effectively a city nearby called Ipswich, where the film crew were based, and it was going to be for like 2 or 3 nights. And there I met Colonel Holt for the first time.
So just for our listeners' point of view, who is Charles Holt, and why is he significant in this case?
Okay, well, let me tell you a bit about the case then. Okay, in UFO history terms worldwide, many people believe that the Rendlesham Forest case is arguably up in the top 5. Some will say the top 2 after Roswell. Obviously, Roswell's a seminal case from 1947. But a lot of people think that because of the numerous incidents that I'll talk about, that Rendlesham Forest is right up there. And so let's talk about Rendlesham Forest. Well, you've got to understand that this event occurs in late December 1980, so a long time ago. And for a long time, very little was known about it other than local people hearing bits of stories. Some local researchers did some invaluable work, but it really didn't become, say, an internationally known case until October of 1983, which is nearly 3 years after the event, when there was a major news story in a British tabloid newspaper called the News of the World, and it had this big headline, and it said, UFO lands in Suffolk and it's official. And the reason why they tagged on it's official is it because they'd got hold of a document which has become known as what's called the Holt Memorandum. And this is a US Air Force headed single sheet of paper, but it's an official American Air Force document. And that was sent from the Air Force to the British Ministry of Defence, because what it said was that the incident had occurred in a forest that lay between 2 US bases that were leased from the Air Force called RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. And in the middle, just for simplistic description, there was a forest, and it was called Rendlesham Forest. So 2 bases, maybe 3 miles apart, separated by Rendlesham Forest. Now, one of the bases at the time, RAF Bentwaters, was a nuclear weapons storage area. I had a weapons storage area that had nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, stored in its underground bunkers.
Okay, was that widely known, Gary?
No.
It wasn't.
I mean, for the book, I found documentation that proved that. But we'll come back to that. But suffice to say that they did exactly what I did, in protecting these tactical nuclear weapons. These were small, low-yield weapons designed to be attached to aircraft in the event of a Third World War scenario in the Soviet Union. Don't forget, 1980 it was still part of the Soviet Union, so it's the Cold War. And so basically, in 3 years later, almost 3 years later, the case, in a sense, goes viral because of this document. And the document was never meant to be released into the public domain. And it was written by this person called Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. Now, at the time, in 1980, he was the deputy base commander of this twin base complex. Okay? Now, we'll go into the incidents in a bit, but suffice to say that he got involved in the incidents or become aware of at least one incident, and then 2 nights later, he himself led a team out into the forest and they experienced multiple UFOs. And what made this document really striking was the fact that someone of his rank had actually written it and said, I was there and I saw multiple UFOs. So
why was that surprising?
Because
someone of his
not
rank.
usually somebody of his rank would go on the record to say that they'd seen UFOs. Don't forget, we're talking about a very time when UFOs were not called UAP. They were not getting a lot of publicity other than pretty much jokey articles a lot of the time. There was a real stigma attached to the subject. So in 1980, it had a bit of a woo-woo factor. And so it's not like it is now, where there is a lot more credence into it. So it was very rare, and to be honest, it still is pretty rare for somebody to say of that rank that I saw multiple UFOs and wrote an official US Air Force document. So that's why the newspaper drew attention to it, and that's why, in a sense, then in newspaper terms and in terms of news media, it went viral. I mean, this is before the era of social media. So, in a sense, things couldn't go viral like we think of them now, that can go around the world in minutes. Well, then, if you had a major story could go around the world, certainly in America and the UK and Europe, within 2 or 3 days. And that's what happened. So this alerted a lot of people in America for the first time that a lot of US Air Force security police personnel had got caught up in an incident whilst they were serving in the UK, in England. And so that's the background. Now let's just quickly talk about why this one-page memorandum that was never supposed to be released caused such a fuss. Well, there were only 3 paragraphs. It was on USA Did notepaper, which was good. But the first paragraph is really interesting because it basically outlines that on one night, and the dates are all a bit confusing, and we can talk about that in a bit, but in late December, we're talking basically the last week of December, that a number of US Air Force security personnel had seen strange moving objects, moving lights, multicolored lights over the forest from an area near to what's called the East Gate, which was the rear gate to RAF Woodbridge. And then the forest is all around. And so they'd seen these lights, reported them, and cutting a long story short, they'd got permission for 3 of the service personnel, security police personnel, to go off base into what was effectively non-US territory. It's British territory, and they go off following these lights, and they end up going into the forest a short distance in a vehicle. They then can't go any further into the forest because the path doesn't go anymore. It just comes to a dead end. So they have to get out on foot, and they follow it. And cutting a long story short, at least 2 of them end up seeing some kind of object on the ground. One of the people,
and this is Jim Penniston and John Burroughs.
John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. Now it's interesting because people's perceptions are slightly different depending on where you are when you see something. Now the person who got closest to the object was Jim Penniston. Sergeant Jim Penniston. And John Burroughs was arguably 20, 30 meters behind, not far away, but he didn't get that close. Now, the object was extremely bright, and as they'd followed it through the forest, and eventually Jim Penniston will say that he got to a clearing and he saw an object at or on the ground, either very close to the ground, hovering, or on the ground. And he described it as being 3 meters by 3 meters, triangular in shape, and to a height at the center of about 2 meters. And basically, he got close to it. At the time, he had a camera. He took photographs of it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. He walked around it. He took his pocketbook out. He made drawings, and he described the object as being like black glass, with a smooth surface, almost a glass-like surface, that was warm to the touch, and he could see kind of a light emanating from within that was moving around. It wasn't a fixed positioned light. There was just various lights moving within it. Now, from John Burroughs' point of view, Airman John Burroughs at the time, he was these 20, 30 meters behind. And what he would say is that he didn't see a structured machine or craft as Jim Penniston did. He said from his position, there was extremely bright light, and he described and drew a series of lights, white, blue, red, and he basically hinted that there was a structure behind it, but basically he couldn't see from his vantage point because of the bright lights, which is entirely fine, but it just shows you how perceptions are different.
Yeah.
The closer one, he's right next to it, he's walked around it, he's touched it, and Jim Penniston will say that when he touched it, he felt that at one point there were like on the windscreen etchings, raised markings, and he said it felt like an etching. And then he said he came across some symbols that he drew in his police pocketbook. Like I say, he took photographs of it, but later on he was told from the base photo lab that they'd been fogged, and so he never got to see them. They'd just basically been seen whited out. Now, you can talk about conspiracy theories and whatever. Now, some people might say that they were fogged out because of maybe radiation from the craft, or maybe they were developed, but he was never going to get to see them because somebody wanted to confiscate them. So that's arguable that could have happened. But he was told.
Let me get a chance to get Gwen in this conversation too.
Okay, Gwen.
Yeah. So,
Do you have any questions?
You have some questions for Gary?
I guess that's no.
If Gwen is here, maybe is she not here? Oh yeah, I don't see her.
Or maybe she just nipped out of the room. So we'll carry on. So
Okay.
that's the first paragraph of this 3-paragraph crucial document. Basically, Holt has spoken, as by the time he's written this memorandum, which was the 13th of January, some 2 weeks after the events, more than 2 weeks, he'd spoken to many of the officers, the airmen involved, and got their stories. So when he wrote this to the Ministry of Defence, something he didn't want to write, he wrote it in a very, he played it down. Whatever he'd witnessed and what people had seen, he played it down. And basically, I think he was worried about his career, that he got involved in this strange kind of UFO case. But in that first paragraph, the first paragraph basically says that 2 nights before he got involved, some US Air Force security personnel came across this triangular object. So that's basically the first paragraph, and it gave dimensions. And then the second paragraph is interesting because it says that a couple of nights later he was told that another UFO had been seen in the forest. So he'd led a small team out into the forest, but by the time that team had assembled and got into the forest, that object had gone. So he said, well, seeing as we're here, will do a forensic examination of the landing of this triangular craft that Jim Pennison had seen 2 nights earlier. So they're at that landing site, which had been checked out, and they found 3 equilateral indentations into the soil in a little clearing, and they were totally equidistant from each other, and each of the depressions were about 9 inches in diameter, maybe 1.5 inches in depth, but they were all the same, as if the same weight had evenly been pushed into the ground from some kind of triangular undercarriage. That's what you assume, some kind of legs, triangular legs underneath. So the second paragraph describes the search of the scene and the dimensions of the craft, and then the third paragraph, which I personally think is the most interesting, is the one where Holt says, whilst we're there, we then see a strange red light moving through the forest. We follow it, and eventually he said that he'd seen multiple objects in the forest that he couldn't explain, and then he signed it. So again, of that Cold War era, it was very rare for somebody who was a deputy base commander of what was a nuclear facility to go on the record, as it were, and put his signature to it. So that's why it became a famous document, because it basically proved that there'd been a landing of a triangular craft, whatever its origin, and then a couple of nights later, he and a team had seen multiple UFOs. So that's really what you knew when the story broke and went kind of media viral in October of 1983. It opened up to the worldwide community, and people were then very interested in the case. Now,
one of the things I heard from you in another interview was that you decided to kind of approach this whole thing as a cold case in terms of a law enforcement. So talk about why that seemed to be a reasonable approach.
Well, if you think that I first directly got involved in the public research when I did that UFO Hunters program, that was late December 2007. But I didn't actually start doing a deep dive research that ended up with the book until 2017. And the reason that prompted that is I was approached by a guy, a director of who wanted to make a documentary about Rendlesham, and he'd heard about me because then I was well known in the UK about it, and he'd said, you know, I'd like you to be the lead investigator on it. Now, I've been involved in quite a few TV productions over the years, but you're never usually given that kind of responsibility. So I thought, well, that's good. You know, if you're going to do that, I want to make sure I'm getting everything right. It has to be spot on if I'm going to put my name to it, as it were. And so I agreed to do it on basically an 18 months remit. I signed a deal, an agreement to work on it for 18 months, thinking that it would all be done in that time. So, in a sense, it wasn't until 2017 that I then thought, I have to get this right if I'm going to do it as lead researcher and get credit for it and co-write it. And so I took it very seriously, and I thought, I'm going to do a deep dive. Now, ironically, I thought at the time, by 2017, that I pretty much knew the case inside out, and probably to most layman's point of view, it sounded like I did. But I was amazed that when I did a really deep dive and looked for any kind of document, old UFO publications from the 80s, old interviews that I came across, and you know, speaking to some of the researchers who'd done previous research on it, I found a lot of stuff that I didn't know. And that's, in a sense, what prompted me to write the book, because I came across things that I'd never heard of in any book. And there's been quite probably by that time 7 or 8 books on Rendlesham by 2017, when I began doing the reinvestigation. And some of them have been very good. You know, the best one, or the best two, was a book called You Can't Tell the People, written by a lady called Georgina Brunei. And it was written, I think, and released about 2000, and she was not a ufologist by any stretch of the imagination, but she was like a gossip columnist journalist.
Hmm.
And she worked with showbiz kind of people, but she heard about this case, and she actually did a very good job in rounding up all the people and witnesses and trying to get a full assessment of the case. And it's a very, very complicated case.
Didn't
And she did,
Nick Pope
yeah.
and John or Jim Peston write a book about?
Oh, that was later though. That was later.
Okay.
That was about 14 or 15 years later that John and Jim wrote a book with Nick Pope. But basically in 2000, she did a great job of assessing the information, and she did a very good job. So in some ways, it was probably the forerunner of my book. In many ways, my book was like 23 years after that.
Wow.
But that was the first, what I would call the first all-round independent, non-witness book that looked at all the information, and it was really very good. The other one that I would recommend early on was a book called Left at Eastgate, which was written by a guy who
Is
turns
that
out
Larry Warren?
Larry Warren, yeah, with Peter Robbins, and that was called Left at Eastgate. And Larry Warren was the original military whistleblower, and that's defined for me because he was the first person to actually say, "My name is Larry Warren," and go on camera and tell his story. Now, there had been other people who would have got that. There was a guy who used a pseudonym, and he was the original person who told some British researchers about it to two housewives, Brenda Butler and Dot Street. They were the first female civilian investigators who heard about the case within days of it happening, because Brenda Butler lived nearby and knew some of the American police personnel, and she'd basically just heard little snippets. But the person who she originally spoken to gave her information that set her on the path to becoming a researcher into the case, but he never went public. He always hid behind a pseudonym, so you can't give it to him. So literally, the first person that stood on camera and said to the world, "I was there, I saw this," was this Larry Warren, and he was 19. First overseas tour, had only been in the Air Force probably 6 months at that time, 5 months at that time. So literally, wrong place, wrong time. And his story was out on its own for a long time, in the sense of a witness who was willing to talk about it. Because don't forget, a lot of the personnel that were mentioned when the memorandum came out in October 1983 were still in the US Air Force, so they weren't allowed to speak freely on it, but their names had been confirmed and identified, so they couldn't speak about it until they retired. So the only person that was really using his own name and speaking about it for about 8 years was this Larry Warren, and he spoke about it in late 1982. Then this memorandum comes out in early of 1983, but it didn't go into the newspaper until October of 1983. So it's a long, circuitous route. But suffice to say, for about 8 years, he was the only one doing media interviews saying, "I am, and this is my name, and this is what I saw."
So let me ask a question about something that Jim Penniston talked about. It's kind of controversial, but get your spin on it. So Penniston had that little notebook that he was going around this craft at. He was
Yeah,
describing the craft. Later on, he started writing what appeared to be a binary code that
yeah.
had information. So what do you know about that?
Oh, quite a lot. In the sense of the binary code, he didn't tell anybody for 30 years about it, essentially. The public did not become aware that he'd written anything in his pocketbook until he spoke about it to the masses, as it were, at what was a 30th anniversary UFO conference in Woodbridge. Well, Woodbridge is a town about 6 miles It's the nearest town to the forest, basically. And they had it in a big community hall. I've given a couple of lectures there. So it's a big place, perhaps maybe 400 people in the audience. And it was to celebrate the 30th anniversary. So 2010, 1980, 2010. And there's quite a few ufologists there. There's Larry Warren there. There's Linda Moulton Howe there. There's Nick Pope there. There's Peter Robbins there. And Jim Penniston suddenly tells the audience, they were taken aback by what he said, is that he couldn't say too much, but he was working on a documentary. But when he had touched the craft, he had then got some kind of physical download into his mind. Now, bear in mind, I was a detective for a long time. There are a few issues with that, not least the fact that he didn't tell anybody for 30 years, and then suddenly he tells the audience. So you can imagine the audience is saying, "Well, why didn't you tell us before?" And his excuse was quite reasonable. He said, "Well, who's going to believe me? They're going to think I'm mad." But surely the person that was with him, John Burroughs, he would have told. He was the only one that would have really understood, because he was 20, 30 meters away. They were out on the same night, so you'd have thought he'd have told him, but he didn't. And when he told the story, a few people in the audience were giving him a bit of a hard time, and he looked very uncomfortable telling the story. Now, there is actually a video of that conference and of Jim being asked these questions. And
where would you find that at, Gary?
It's a link. There's a link to it in my book. I can dig it out and send you it. Have you got my book?
No, I haven't.
Well, you should, you see. But anyway,
I should, yeah.
All the references in there. But yeah, there's like a 2-hour video. It's not the whole event, but it's the main part. And it includes Jim Penniston talking about it. Now, I'd seen this a while ago, but when I was doing the re-research, I thought I'm going to watch it again and transcribe it for the book, or parts of it. And a very interesting thing happens when he's talking to the audience. He says, who was I going to tell? I thought I was just crackers. I didn't know what it was. And it sounds all very plausible. But then, whilst he's still talking to that same audience, and it was lost on the audience because they're still reeling from these new revelations, he actually says, well, actually, I did know what it was. So he kind of contradicts himself, because basically he said that he'd worked with Linda Moulton Howe and he'd been hypnotized in 1994. And in 1998, a partial transcript of that hypnosis session was in a book that Linda Moulton Howe had written called Glimpses of Other Realities. Mm-hmm. And in that partial transcript, the first part of it starts off, "Can you see the binary codes?" Which is a bit bizarre, which makes it sound like it could be an implanted memory, because it doesn't specify. It's some unnamed person who is asking this, like during an interrogation. Well, we know he was interrogated, but this is done under hypnosis. So I have a real problem with hypnosis in the sense of it's interesting. It throws up interesting anecdotes, but that's all they are, because you can't prove it. You can't hang your case just on hypnosis. You need proper evidence.
So let me ask a question for clarification. So is Penniston saying that he only remembered the code under hypnosis, or did he take down some of that code without being?
Well, no. What he basically said was that, well, to all intents and purposes, he said in 2010 at this conference that basically when I touched it, I got this download of information. And the way he wrote it down is this. He said, basically, I had this transfer information. When I got home, he was married. When I got home, I woke up the next day and things are flashing through my mind, and I just feel that I have to write what I can see in my mind. And all he could see in his mind was ones and zeros, 001, 110, and he ended up writing a number of pages. And the number of pages is controversial because he uses different numbers, when he's telling people, which is a bit of a red flag. that, you know, I think I'd remember how many pages I wrote, especially if it was so bizarre as that. So basically what he said is that he had to have like a controlled download of information, like automatic writing, and he wrote it down, and then at the end of it, he felt a lot better for it, and he'd got all these pages of zeros and ones. And he told the audience that he didn't know what it was. He thought it was just gibberish, you know. And if I tell anybody, they're going to think I'm crazy and I'm going to get kicked out of the Air Force. Now, that's understandable. He didn't want to lose his career, so at that time, that's understandable. But perhaps not for 30 years. So while he was in the Air Force, you could imagine him keeping his head down and not really telling too many people. But you would have thought he would have probably told John Burroughs, who he'd been with that night. But anyway, suffice to say that he said he just kept them in his pocketbook, didn't tell anybody about them until actually Linda Moulton Howe. But he'd contradicted himself. He'd said to the audience, it's only recently for this documentary, literally in the last couple of months, so we're talking October of 2010, when they're making this documentary, that he produces his pocketbook and somebody sees all these zeros and ones, 0, 1, 1, 0, ones and zeros in his pocketbook. They'll say, well, what's that? And in fact, John Burroughs goes, what's that? And he says, well, I don't know what it is. But the trouble is, he did know what it was, because he'd had an hypnosis session in 1994. Now, let's put yourself in his position. So you're hypnotized, you've had some kind of UFO experience, and they say, we want to hypnotize you. Okay. Now, if you're hypnotized, you won't know what's come out during that hypnosis. It was videoed. And so at the end of it, you'd have probably said, well, was I hypnotized? Did I say anything? And at that point there, somebody would have said, well, yeah, it was pretty strange. You said all these things. And then you'd say, well, show me. You'd naturally go, show me the video. Now, according to him, he didn't. He didn't even watch it. So he didn't know what it was. Well, that doesn't make sense to me, because I think in such a bizarre scenario, your curiosity would say, well, you're saying I said some strange things. Well, I want to see it, just to confirm it. And that's when he would have heard about the zeros and ones. And then surely he'd have gone, well, I don't know what zeros and ones are. And somebody would have gone, well, it's mathematical terminology, it's binary code. So he would have found out that he spewed out, allegedly, binary code. And then he'd have gone, well, what's binary code? You know, so how can he then be saying 30 years in 2010 to the audience, I didn't know what it was, and then contradict himself, and it was lost on the audience. And if you view the video, you'll hear him do it. He says, well, I did know, because I did work with Linda Moulton Howe. So, but it was that bit was totally lost. The other thing that raised a lot of red flags for me was when he said initially for this documentary, where the pocketbook had first been come to notice, was he said that only 6 pages of the binary code had been used to then get, in a sense, scrutinized and deciphered. Because he didn't have a clue, he's not mathematical in any way, so he was relying on other people to come back. Well, for the documentary that I think aired a couple of months later, a few weeks later, they basically said that it pointed to 7 different geographical coordinates around the world, including the pyramids and a place off Ireland called High Brazil, which was an alleged island that now sunken underwater, and that there'd been some partial English that had been translated that basically said, I think it was from 8,100 years coming back in time. We're doing a surveillance. We're going back in time. So basically, future humans have come back in time to do research. For some reason, the planet's struggling, but it had all these geographical coordinates. Now, here's the thing: if somebody had said to you, "You've written these down and you had them in your pocketbook from that night," and even if you didn't know genuinely how many pages you'd written, the first time a journalist or a member of the audience and said, well, how many pages of binary code did you write down in your pocketbook? For the very first time, you could have gone, well, actually, I'm not sure. I'll go check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You count them out. So if you ever ask that question again, Oh, there's 8. There's 6. You'd know. Common sense, you'd know. Well, he went on to do a couple of radio shows, and he said there were 6 pages, then there were 8 pages, then there were 10, there were 11, there were 12, and it turns out there were 16 pages.
Wow.
So that throws up a lot of red flags because it's such a unique kind of scenario. You'd think, wow, this is a one-off event in my life. And somebody's asked me a legitimate question, how many pages are there? You'd know
Yeah.
after that
So,
checking.
so Gary, what does that tell you about the story about the code
It
and what it
it
means?
says to me there's a lot of red flags and there's lots of other things I could say. He went in the days and weeks after he told that audience in 2010. He went on a couple of radio shows, and one was with a lady called Angela Joyner, who's quite well known in America. And you'd still get this audio. Look it up on YouTube, and it's in the book, and there's transcripts of it. And he makes a lot of contradictory statements in that. And for me, that just throws up a lot of red flags. I'm not saying you can't have a download of information, because I think you can. But I think in these circumstances, he's been made so many contradictory statements early on that it throws up a lot of red flags, and I'm suspicious of it. So I
Right.
wouldn't really give it any credence. And from a cold case police review, I later had an online Facebook discussion, messenger discussion with his co-author, who worked on his book UFO Enigma, Rendlesham Enigma, and it concluded that he admitted that basically it was a standalone account, and in policing terms, that means there's no other corroboration. Now, if you're talking about such an incredible story of humans, time traveling humans coming back, it's a kind of fantastic tale. I'm not saying it can't happen, but there's lots of inconsistencies. And basically, it'd be a bit like me waking up tomorrow and saying, I am Jesus reborn, and telling everybody I'm Jesus reborn. Well, who's going to believe me? Nobody, because it's a standalone account and it's such a big story. If it were true, nobody's really going to give you that credence. Well, that's where we are. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm not saying it's an absolute lie, but I have a lot of problems with it because of the inconsistencies at the time and the things that he said around its delivery, telling the audience, and the inconsistencies, the number of pages, other things as well that's in the book. And so for
Do we
me,
know?
it's an interesting account, but that's all it is.
Do we know who interpreted the code? Who came up
There's been
with the name?
various people look at it, and what his co-author Gary Osborne has done a lot of work on it, and I think subsequently they have gone on to write at least 2 of the volumes all about the binary codes. And according to Jim Penniston, all Rendlesham about is time traveling humans, nothing else, which is totally contradictory to everybody else's account. And if at the end of my book, I concluded that there were 17 different timed UFO events that we know about.
Over those 2 days
No, not over 2 days, over about a week-long period.
Okay, this in December of
Yeah,
1980.
so this is late December 1980. But we had, during the course of my reinvestigation, I spoke to a lot of people and got a lot more new information and new sighting events that we were unaware of. So I think I should, in the time that we've got, is tell you some of the major things that came out.
Yeah, do that, please. Yeah, do you have a copy of your book there with you?
No, but I can recall it very easily because I've done
No,
lots.
what I was just going to have you do is show us the picture and then
All
tell us
right.
where you can get it.
Hang on. It means me going away for 30 seconds.
Hey,
All
go
right,
for it.
stand by. Stand by. Okay, I'm back in the room.
All
So
right.
this
Oh, yeah,
book,
cool.
this is the title. It's called Non-Human, the
Okay.
Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents. It's only available on Amazon. I self-published it, and it's 500 pages.
Cool.
It's a 5-year re-research, 3 years in the writing. So that's the book, available in Amazon all around the world.
Amazon. Okay. Okay.
Okay, I can send you a
Continue
link
on.
for when you put it out, so you can link to that. But right, the key things that came out from the re-research, that new stuff, was the first thing I think is I heard about and spoke to an airman who had never spoken about an earlier incident. He turns out that he'd had a sighting late in the year, November of 1980. So there'd been a number of incidents, UFO-related incidents, sightings with security police that had taken place throughout 1980 in the run-up to those late December events. So you'd had 3 or 4, but the three main ones that I articulate in the book are one from February involving Laurie Raphael, who you spoke about as had been a guest on your show.
Right. Right.
And then a guy, an airman from July, and then this other airman, Airman Wagner, who came forward and about his own sighting that had occurred in November. Now, in November, he'd seen actually on RAF Woodbridge, on RAF Bentwaters, very close to the weapons storage area, he'd seen a strange glowing red beach ball size object near the aircraft on what was called the flight line, which was very close to the weapons storage area. Now, he'd reported it, and he had basically got told off for reporting it. Like, don't tell us that kind of stuff. We don't want to know. So he'd said to his friends that if ever he saw anything else, he wouldn't report it. He'd just keep it to himself. Well, in getting that story from November from him, I said, have you seen anything else? And he told this story about he'd never reported, but he said, well, I didn't see anything else, but I went to another strange incident. And I said, what? And he said this, and I believe him, and he came over very sincere, was that and he's sure that it's pre-Christmas. Now, we believed for many, many years, 30 odd years, that the original incident was the night of Christmas Eve going into Christmas night going into Boxing Day, 25th into the 26th. But this guy, Herman Wagner, he said, I'm pretty certain it was before Christmas because I remember my shifts, and he said it was the 23rd of December. And what he said was that he was on mobile patrol, and he was called with a colleague to go to the back gate at RAF Woodbridge, which is the gate that I mentioned before, where lights have been seen out, what turns out now, a couple of days after that. But this is before Christmas. And he said the reason why he'd been called to the East Gate was because the airman, the security policeman, had seen something go into the forest that had frightened him. And he didn't want to be left alone. Well, that's kind of odd in itself. So he went there, they spoke to him, and the airman didn't want to go out into the forest. And he said something had gone down into the forest near to the East Gate. Now, up until that time, nobody had ever heard of an early pre-Christmas sighting. And so this is entirely new information. And what he said was, and the forest now looks completely different from it did then, because there was a massive storm in 1987, and 90% of the original trees were knocked down in akin to a hurricane. Well, in the UK, you don't get hurricanes, but it was a major storm, 90% of the trees. So it's all been replanted, and they're not the same species of tree. So anyway, it looked different. Now, at the time, so 23rd of December 1980, he said the object went into the forest, it dropped down into the forest, and it was maybe only 150 yards away from the security gate. That's pretty close. And that's what frightened him. So anyway, they said, right, we'll go take a look. And anyway, they went into the forest, 150 yards away, and they didn't actually see any craft or anything like that. But this is what was interesting. He said, we came across a triangular set of indentations in the ground in a little clearing. Now, here's the interesting thing. They were absolutely equidistant, so equidistant equilateral triangle. But here's the difference to the other landing that takes place now a couple of days after that. He says that each depression was about 5 feet across.
Wow.
So not 9 inches, as per the Jim
5 feet.
Burrows, 5 feet, 3 big, deep indentations, like a much bigger craft had landed with a lot of weight at 5 feet across. So again, why is he going to make that up? He's not. He's a very genuine guy, military guy, and he came across very sincerely. I'm very good at sussing out whether people are lying to me and whatever. And he came across very sincere, and I just can't think of why he's going to make that up. So anyway, that was his account. Now here's more what is really interesting. Now, one of the things that had always been rumoured to have occurred was beams coming down into the nuclear weapons storage area. Now, Holt had made comments over the years saying that beams had, while he was out in the forest with his team, they'd seen lights from a UFO being shone in the general direction of where the weapons storage area was at the Bentwaters, and they were too far away, so he couldn't know. But then when I met Colonel Holt, because he retired as a colonel at the time of the incident, he was a lieutenant colonel. But when I met him, he was a retired colonel, and we got on really well. And he told me at the top of the weapons storage area, tower, so inside where they keep the nukes, or they used to keep the nukes, we're up at the top high tower, which has got this perfect 360-degree vantage point. That's why it was much higher than the rest of the forest, so it could have this 360 view for security purposes. And I got my video camera with me at the time, and he told me beforehand, the night before, when I first met him, that other witnesses had confirmed that a witness inside the weapons storage area had seen the beams coming down inside. So this would have been a first-person witness. And so I said when we got up to the top, just for my benefit, would you allow me to film you saying what you've told me last night? And he said, yeah, fair enough. So he basically says a guy in the tower, the security guy in the tower, had contacted him first and said that he'd been up in the tower on one of the nights, not sure which night, but on one of the nights he'd been up in the tower, and he confirmed that a beam from a UFO had been shone down into the nuclear weapons storage bunkers. And he gave me a partial name, and he said his name was Rick. And I thought, wow, this is good, this is looking good. And then he tagged on something that he hadn't told me previously, and he said, and the security personnel on the ground walking inside the weapons storage area had seen the beams too. So in a sense, there's like 3 witnesses there that can maybe be traced. And I got that all on video, and that's been out on my UFO Truth magazine website since about 2014. So it's had lots of views, so it's out there. Later on, he denied ever saying that to me, but it's out on video, so you have a contradiction.
He said it.
Yeah, he said it's there for him to see. But suffice to say is, because he went back on it, and in his book, The Whole Perspective, he said, no, I couldn't be specific. And he doesn't tell this story that he told me. So I found that odd. So anyway, because he changed his story in a sense, it wasn't a first-person account. Because it turns out the guy I spoke to was an airman who was a guy called Rick Bobo, and he had a UFO sighting, and he had worked up in the tower. So you're thinking, well, how many Ricks is there? But he said, no, that's not me. So and he tells a different story of a different huge UFO over the base, and then small.
So Gary, I want to be sensitive to time here, and that you might not you might have other things to do besides talk to me. So here's kind of two final questions I'd like to leave you with. First of all, sounds like there are a lot of contradictory stories in the official account of Rendlesham. Some may have been told by Jim Penniston. Others may have been told by other people. What does that say about this whole incident at Rendlesham Forest? That's the first question.
Well, how long have we got left? How long do you want to go for? 15 minutes?
Yeah, so
All right. Well, let me cram in then the latter part of this. I
okay.
got a first-person witness called Steve Longero came forward, an airman, and he said he'd been new to the base and he was put inside a weapons storage area and walking around with an experienced airman, learning the ropes, as it were. And he said I was inside, walking around with my gun, my M16 inside the weapons storage area when he saw a UFO come over the forest tops and then shine a beam down into the weapons storage area and did like a grid light search, a laser beam search of all the bunkers along a stretch of about 300 meters. So that was major because he went forward for the first time and gave this first person account. So it's the first time we had that confirmed. So Beam, he puts his name and says, I am Steve Longera, Steve Longera. I was inside, I saw beams coming down into the weapons storage by UFO. So that's a sensational story if you think about it from a national security point of view. Well, the big thing that comes out is that for a long time, a woman called Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, who was a shift commander, a young black lady doing really well, and she was one of the shift commanders. She happened to be on mobile patrol when there was a call over the radio. Something's gone down into the forest. Because she happened to be on mobile patrol, she takes up the radio and says, I'll respond to it. Then literally a couple of minutes later, she's screaming on the radio, help, 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 Bobby, 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 help me, help me. Frantic. So something happened to him, we didn't know what. And for many, many years, all we knew is that something traumatic had happened and she'd ended up going off shift, effectively going sick, and never really to ever go on shift again. And she soon went back to the United States. So something clearly had happened. We didn't know what it was for years and years. And then an airman called Michael Stacey Smith came forward, and again I interviewed him for a book over his earlier July sighting. And again, I asked the question, anything else happened that was unusual? And he told me about this story, and he ends up confirming this story, saying that he was told to quickly go open up the back gate of RAF Pentwaters, which was called the Butler Gate. And then he said, just stay there, some vehicles are going to go shooting out. 2 or 3 vehicles go shooting out. And then the next thing is about 10 minutes later, he sees Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin as a front seat passenger being driven back in through the gate, and she's crying, she's dishevelled, she's not got a berry on, she's looked like she's been roughed up, and she's absolutely shaking like a leaf. Don't know what's happened. And then 10 minutes after that, her vehicle that she'd been driving on a rural back country lane between the two bases, so on what was a UK road between the two bases, her vehicle gets driven in. It's still drivable, but all the vehicle roof is smashed in as if it's rolled. It's had an accident and it's gone over on its side. He goes in to see a sergeant and says, well, what the hell's happened here? And the sergeant says to him, I'll tell you the story, but you must never mention my name. And he did, and he was good friends with the sergeant. I've no reason to believe that he's lying. But he basically then said that she's on a lonely country road. She's responding to this call. She's maybe a mile away from RAF Woodbridge on a backcountry British lane when suddenly a red glowing object the size of a car pulls alongside of her at hedgerow height. So can you imagine here, she's in a Jeep or a truck or whatever she's in, and then she's a military vehicle, and then she looks to her left and she sees this object parallel with her, this glowing ball, a large ball. Freaks her out. She loses control. She ends up crashing into a ditch, rolling the vehicle. She manages to clamber out. She's uninjured, but she's roughed up. She climbs out, and this object has stopped and it's hovering and looking down on her. How frightening would that be? She then gets a weapon off the seat and she fires several shots at it, and off it goes. All of that was covered up by the US Air Force. The bullets were put back. Nobody told it. And again, a major story that came out. And perhaps the biggest story that was in the book, and it accounts for about 110 pages of a 500-page book, is an interview with a very important military witness called Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. Adrian Bustinza ends up corroborating the Larry Warren account, this controversial or deemed controversial second account, and he corroborates it almost identically for me in a 4.5-hour transatlantic call. And he basically says that he ended up in a field beside Larry Warren in a cordon around another landed craft that was much bigger this time, perhaps 30 feet across. And it was translucent. You couldn't look at it straight on. It was shimmering, but he admitted that he'd seen some kind of life form or entity that was beside it. And Larry Warren had said that right back in late 1982, that there'd actually been entities seen beside the craft. And that the base commander was a guy called Colonel Gordon Williams, who was in charge of 12,000 personnel and the twin bases. He ends up having like a silent face-off beside the craft with these three entities. And
what did the entities look like? Is there any description?
Well, it was very strange. Larry Warren would say is that off the fabric of the craft, what looked like a bubble slipped off the craft. Didn't come out through a doorway, nothing opens, but like a bubble slips off the fabric of the translucent craft, and then the bubble separates into three bubbles. And within each of the three bubbles was the upper torso of a small being, what we would now describe as a grey, with large eyes, pale skin, wearing some kind of upper clothing. But it was floating, and it was only the upper extremities. And there was no speech heard, but Colonel Gordon Williams was there, having 6-10 feet away, with other senior officers having like a silent, maybe a telepathic communication. Now, it sounds incredible, like Star Trek. Larry Warren had said it many years earlier, and over the years he'd been castigated, and people were saying, no, you're making it up. But then, for the course of the book, it took me 2 years to get an interview with Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. But when he did, he corroborated it almost entirely. And he said also, and corroborated the fact that that incident was being filmed on motion picture footage, i.e. video cameras and cinefilm. They basically corroborated each other that incident was being filmed, almost as if it was planned.
So that film was out there. Film was out there somewhere, right? The film was out there.
Well, what happened was, we know that the footage existed because what happened was, literally as soon as it all happened, Colonel Williams was collected by a Captain Mike Verano, so a senior officer beneath him, but a senior officer who drove him to a waiting F-16. They were carrying a top secret satchel, and Captain Mike Verano, who's gone on the record on a couple of occasions has said this, he said, what's in the top secret satchel? And Colonel Williams, the base commander, said, it's the video of the UFO, motion picture footage. Wow. It's not photographs, it's motion picture footage, moving images. And he said he stepped up the ladder, gave it to the pilot, and the pilot took it, and then it flew off, and it went originally to Area Ramstein, which was the headquarters of the 8th Air Force in Germany, in West Germany. Right. And then after that, we know ends up in Washington at the Pentagon, because a researcher called Ray Boucher, many years later, developed a rapport with their Freedom of Information researcher, worker called Ann Turner, and she told him that she'd heard pilots, US pilots, talking about the Rendlesham video, and even though there was no record of it in her records at the Pentagon. So it still probably exists somewhere in the bowels. So if ever there is true disclosure, that footage may still exist. But do I think, from a former police detective point of view, yes, there's clear corroboration to think that incident, this controversial alleged incident with a second landing and entities being seen, which has been so castigated over the years, but when Sergeant Adrian Bustinza came forward, that was a huge corroboration of Larry Warren's account. So that says to me, and a very nice guy, ended up spending 30 years 35, 40 years in law enforcement in the States, with his military career, police career, and also then in corrections. So he had something like 40 years service. Absolutely stand-up guy. I met him. I spoke to him online in this transatlantic call, and subsequently had other interviews with him. And it's all in the book, but his testimony is so vital because of that corroboration. So there's some major things that came out. But what the biggest thing is, there is agendas at play, in my opinion, as a former detective, that by not only the US government, the British government, to play this case down because it's such a good case. The media, and certainly in the UK, have been complicit in playing it down and trying to downplay the significance of the case. But you hear people like Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon talking about Rendlesham. It's a very real case. And at the end of my book, I had 17 different timed events over like a 1 week period because of this earlier incident from the 23rd. So it's really, if you believe him, which I do, you're looking at between the 23rd and maybe the 29th of December. So lots of things, different timed events, 17 different timed events. That's a lot.
So here's a kind of final question for you. And this has caused me to think a whole lot about what I thought I knew about Rendlesham Forest. So go beyond Rendlesham Forest. What does this say about the relationship between governments and possible ETs? Where are we at with this? Are we ever going to get some kind of disclosure, or is this?
I think everything that's happened since 2017, with the New York Times article, the likes of ORSAP, ATIP, the people that have come forward, you've obviously got Louise Elizondo, you've got David Grush. All these are very, very credible people. Carl Nell, Rear Admiral Tim Galladay, people like that. These are top-notch people, and the legislation has been passed in recent years. With the Schumer amendment that would have led to the UAP Disclosure Act has not gone through full, but I'm told it's going to be resubmitted again. We tried for the last 2 years to get it through. The bottom line is there's been more things happening in America since 2017 than any time in the previous 50 years. So we've had congressional hearings too now, with witnesses, obviously David Grush, Commander David Farrell, military pilots, and then of course you've had Louise Elizondo, and the main from that, the one that I thought was interesting was Rear Admiral Tim Galladay. People of that rank going on the record, Colonel going on the record. These are very, very senior people, and they're saying that we're dealing with some non-human intelligence. Personally, I still think it's extraterrestrial, but it could be anything in terms of interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, infraterrestrial, whatever you want to call it. We are dealing with something that's non-human. And I think we are closer now, at any time in my lifetime, I'm now 64, any time in my lifetime to a major breakthrough. We look at the new administration that's come into the White House. A lot of the people that's put into senior positions, like Mark Rubio, John Ratcliffe, they're all very pro, or have spoken out prior to taking office. They've all been very pro disclosure and getting the truth out there. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things politically happening with the Middle East and Ukraine, Russia war and things like that. But I think there will come a time where these legitimate questions, like you said that you were going to disclose everything on the UAP, let's see what happens. I hope that President Trump will become the disclosure president, because it's been 80 years in the making, and there's been a real cover up. Everything that most serious researchers know, the links to nuclear weapons, great books like UFO and Nukes by Robert Hastings, brilliant book. So there are so much good information out there on cases all around the world. I'm actually the vice president of an international coalition of researchers, scientists, and academics called ISA, the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. We're a non-profit NGO, and we have representatives in about 30 countries now. So we're talking about a global issue, and we have to start addressing it now as a global issue. It's not just American, it's not just British. It's
a human
every
issue.
every country of the world has the issue.
Yeah, human issue.
Yeah, so it's a human race issue, and we have to really start looking at that from a global perspective. And I like I say, I know time is short, but I do think that we are very, very close within this year, within 3 years, possibly this year.
It'd be interesting to see. Well, Gary, I want to thank you for coming on our show. I don't know what happened to Gwen. She somehow disappeared, but I thank
she
you.
must have got bored listening to me, so I guess.
Well, I don't know. I don't know
She's
what
disappeared
happened.
or she's gone ill.
Could have been technical issue. And your book is entitled Non-Human, right?
Yeah, I'll send you the links. I'll send you the cover of the book, and I'll send
And
you links to it.
And you can get it at Amazon.
Yeah, it's only available on Amazon. And there's a story in itself. I could have gone to a major publisher, but if I'd have done so, I think various witnesses would have tried to close me down because they were frightened of the impartial information I was going to give, because I was just going to tell it warts and all from a police point of view, from an evidential point of view. And so I chose to self-publish it just to get the information out there.
Understood. Understood. Well, thank you very much. And once we get this edited, I'll send you a copy of it. You can do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate being a guest, and anytime.